He was already dead. 3 days later, an entire kingdom needed him alive. Nobody told him that dying was only the start of the real work. A bearded man stood over him holding a pitchfork like a weapon. The man looked at him the way you look at a corpse that moves. And honestly, he was right. This body died 3 days ago. Bread in the road, the man said. Be gone from here by noon. He threw a piece of gray bread and slammed the pigsty door shut. The stranger picked up the bread. He sniffed it. He took a bite. The teeth in his mouth were rotten, but the bread was real enough. He chewed slowly, and somewhere behind his eyes, a bridge flashed into view. 3 in the morning, a steering wheel turning hard to the right. Water, darkness, then absolutely nothing at all. Now a pig stared at him without a shred of interest. 2 moons hung low through a hole in a rotting thatched roof. One was fat and yellow. The other was small and pale blue. He spat into the mud and said it plainly to himself. Fine. I'm dead. This wasn't Oregon. Not even Earth. And he was standing barefoot in a stranger's manure, in a stranger's skin. Pieces of memory surfaced from somewhere deep inside this borrowed body. Dan Hopper, a farmhand, 23 years old. No family left to speak of. No one would cry for this body. No one would come looking for it. He stood up. His legs shook from the fever, but they held. He stepped into the yard, and what he saw made him freeze completely. A muddy road curled downhill toward a village of thatched roofs. Past the village stood a forest. Past the forest stood blue mountains. A whole world he had never asked to be part of. He walked downhill, and something rusted and half-buried caught his eye. He knelt in the mud. He pulled it free with both hands. A broken fragment of a plowshare. Heavy, rough, full of bubbles and slag. But it was iron. Real iron, forged by real hands, somewhere near. And something clicked inside him. Not magic. Not some flash of inspiration. Just 20 years of manual labor folding itself into a single, quiet thought. There was iron here. There was wood, fire, and water here. There had to be forges nearby, because someone had already forged the scrap. And what wasn't here mattered even more than what was. No bearings, no gears more complicated than a simple millstone. No springs, no chain drives, no engines of any kind. Nothing like the machines Dan Hopper had spent decades taking apart. He tucked the iron fragment inside his coat and kept walking downhill. The village was called Crosstone, and it barely deserved the name. An old woman by the well flinched hard at the sight of him. She muttered that it was a 2-day walk south to the nearest town. That the road was dangerous. That bandits had wiped out a caravan last week. That there hadn't been a single horse in this village for a year. Every horse had been taken away to feed somebody's distant war. And that was the exact moment Dan Hopper started to smile. A world with no horses left in it at all. He headed south, and with every step, the math built itself in his head. Smithies meant coal. Coal and water together could make steam. Steam could push a piston. A piston could turn a wheel. A wheel could carry more weight than any set of human legs. And whoever built that wheel first would matter more than any king. He coughed hard from his weakened lungs, and he smiled anyway. For the first time in either of his 2 lives, he had a plan. That night, he slept wrapped in a rattan sack under a tree. He dreamed of water, of darkness, and of an engine slowly turning over. On the second day, he reached a wrecked caravan on the roadside. 2 wagons lay overturned. Crates were smashed open. Blood stained the dirt. No bodies anywhere. He crouched and studied the broken axles carefully. The hubs had worn down to nothing. Not a drop of grease in sight. These wagons had been dying long before any bandit ever touched them. He salvaged a leather strap and 2 iron rings before he moved on. By evening, the town of Grimshall rose out of the hills ahead. 100 houses behind a stone wall, a market, a church with a tower, and smoke, thick black smoke pouring from 3 separate points in town. Forges. His heart picked up speed, but not from any kind of fear. He found old Horvick's forge at the southern edge of the town. The military forge was closed to strangers. The guild forge took no outsiders. That left one option, a stubborn old blacksmith who paid too little and cursed too much. The yard looked like time had simply stopped there 50 years ago. Soot-stained walls, a shed, an anvil, a water barrel, and endless scattered junk. Scraps of iron, cracked cauldrons, rusted hinges, broken chains everywhere he looked. He stood in the middle of that metal graveyard, and he smiled again. To anyone else, it was garbage. To him, it was paradise. Horvick stepped out of the house, a sturdy man well past 60. His hands looked like shovels. His eyes sized Dan up in a heartbeat. Dan said he was looking for work, that he knew how to handle metal. He said all he needed was a roof and something to eat. Horvick snorted. He met 100 drifters who confused a hammer with a sledgehammer. But he needed a pair of hands to chop wood and haul coal. Don't run off in 3 days, and maybe you'll stick around, the old man said. Dan was given the shed behind the forge as a place to sleep. That evening, Horvik's wife brought him porridge and stared at him too long. Grandma Ruth said he was too skinny, and that there'd be meat tomorrow. For 3 days straight, Dan chopped wood, hauled coal, and said nothing at all. Horvik watched him the whole time, without saying a single word about it. On the 3rd day, Horvik struck a loop wrong, and the metal rippled. The old man cursed and tossed the ruined piece into a scrap barrel. The moment Horvik turned his back, Dan pulled the piece back out. The metal was still warm. He set it on the anvil. 3 precise blows straightened the ripple, exactly 3. Not 1 blow more. Horvik turned at the sound. He walked over. He looked at the loop. He looked at Dan. He said nothing. He carried the piece back inside. That night, Grandma Ruth brought a double portion and a slice of pie. She said the old man had asked about him. That was a very good sign. On the 5th day, Dan asked to look at the broken mill mechanism. Horvik grimaced. That junk had been sitting dead for half a year already. A new gear from the capital cost 20 silver coins and 3 months of waiting. The whole village had been buying overpriced flour from neighboring towns instead. Horvik had tried to fix it himself and had given up completely. Go ahead, he said. It can't get any worse than it already is. Dan sat beside the mechanism for half a day without touching a thing. He wasn't looking at a broken gear. He was looking at an entire system. There were 2 smaller gears in the corner, rough but still intact. An intermediate shaft, a wooden pulley, and a leather belt could make this work. The millstone would turn slower, but it would turn, and that was everything. He wasn't fixing what was broken. He was rebuilding what was possible. There were 2 smaller gears lying forgotten in the corner of the shed. The teeth were rough, but they were whole, and whole was enough to start. As he studied the gears, something on the shed wall caught his attention. A faint carving near the door frame, a circle split by 8 spokes. Just a mark some long-dead carpenter had scratched there out of boredom, probably. Dan glanced at it twice, shrugged, and went back to studying the gears. He filed the notch. He fit the shaft. He checked every single clearance twice. By dusk, the pieces were ready, and the water wheel stood waiting outside. Horvik watched from the doorway, arms crossed, saying absolutely nothing at all. Grandma Ruth stood beside him with a rag twisted tight in both hands. Neither of them believed this would work. Neither of them said it out loud. Dan knelt by the sluice gate, and he called for the water to run. The gate lifted. Water rushed against the wheel, and the wheel began to turn. The new gears meshed with a grinding scrape, then settled into rhythm. The belt pulled tight across the wooden pulley Dan had shaped by hand. And the millstone, dead for half a year, trembled and began to move. Slowly, with effort, but it was moving, and it did not stop moving. Dan poured grain into the hopper with hands that would not stay steady. Flour spilled out from under the stone, coarse, gray, uneven, and absolutely real. Horvik didn't move. He just stared at the flour piling on the floor. By morning, half the village stood crowded in the blacksmith's yard to see it. Half a year without flour. Half a year of triple prices from neighboring towns. And now grain went in one side and flour came out the other. Horvik poured Dan a mug of beer without a single word of explanation. He sat across from him, looked him dead in the eye, and finally asked, "Kid, who are you, really?" Dan thought for a second, then answered simply. "Just a mechanic," he said, and Horvik didn't push for anything more than that. A man who does more with his hands than he explains with his mouth. That earned a roof and a hot meal in Horvik's world, and nothing else mattered. The next day, Dan moved from the barn into a small room by the forge. For a week straight, he worked 12 hours a day at Horvik's forge. Hinges, staples, horseshoes, plow points, and endless nails. Always more nails. The iron here was worse than what Dan had known in his old life. Full of slag, bubbles, and uneven strength from one piece to the very next. But Dan had spent 20 years fixing pre-war trucks out of scavenged junk parts. Bad material was nothing new. He simply adapted the way he always had. By the 2nd week, Dan started rearranging the whole shop without asking permission first. Tools he used often went low, within easy reach of a tired hand. Then Dan built something small that changed the entire rhythm of the forge. A foot-powered mechanism for the whetstone, made from scraps of wood and leather. No more turning the stone by hand while both hands were needed elsewhere. Now a single push of the foot kept the blade sharp and the hands free. Horvik stared at the contraption for a long 5 minutes without blinking once. 40 years in this forge, he finally said, and I never once thought of that. By the end of the 2nd week, Dan needed something stronger than a leather belt. A chain, and for a chain he needed identical, repeatable, mass-produced small parts. So he forged mirror image bars with a link-shaped notch between them. A crude die? heat the rod, strike it between the bars, file the burrs. The first chain came out crooked. 3 of 20 links snapped under load immediately. He took it apart, he started over. The third attempt actually held together. Horvik looked at the finished chain and had no idea what it was for. Dan explained. It carries force between two wheels, more precise than any belt. Horvik thought it over, then called it a bridle, made only out of metal. Dan laughed for the first time in weeks and said that was exactly right. That same week, an idea took root in Dan's head that would not let go. A vehicle with no horse, for wheels, pedals, a chain, and nothing else needed. He had no paper, so he drew on flat pieces of slate with a nail. Horvik caught him sketching by candlelight one night and studied the strange lines. Genius or madman, the old man decided, and either way you need to eat more. Grandma Ruth started serving double portions after that, and never once explained why. It took 3 full weeks to build the machine Dan called the Velomobile. The hardest part was the differential, something Dan had rebuilt 100 times before. Here, he had rough castings and a hammer, and he simplified the design brutally. Not a true differential, just an overrunning clutch that let one wheel slip on turns. Rough, inefficient, but it worked, and working was the only standard that mattered here. On the morning it was finished, Dan rolled the machine into the yard at dawn. Grandma Ruth came out for water and dropped the bucket where she stood. Dan sat on the wooden seat, gripped the steering stick, and pressed the pedals down. The chain pulled tight, the wheels turned, and he moved without a single horse. Slowly, creaking, swaying over every bump, but moving on the strength of his own legs. Horvik ran outside in his underwear and stood frozen at the sight of it. He crouched down. He turned the pedal by hand. He watched the chain engage. He stood up slowly and said he needed to sit down immediately. This changes everything, the old blacksmith said, staring at for wheels and a chain. Dan shook his head. It's a toy, he said. One rider. Light load. Low speed. But it's proof, he added. Proof that a person can move without a horse at all. And if a person can move on leg power alone, steam power could move far more. Horvik asked what steam power even meant. Dan pointed to the water boiler by the forge. When water boils, he said, steam pushes against the lid with real, physical force. If it can push a lid, he said, it can push a piston just as hard. And if it can push a piston, he said, it can turn a wheel by itself. Horvik's eyes went wide. He called Dan a madman, but a madman worth listening to. That same day, Dan rode the Velomobile out past the gate toward a neighboring village. On foot, the trip took 2 hours. On the Velomobile, he made it in 40 minutes. Children ran alongside him screaming. One old man crossed himself at the sight. On the ride back, Dan understood something the Velomobile alone could never prove. Human legs were not enough. Real transport needed something with far more power than muscle. It needed steam, and steam needed a boiler strong enough to survive real pressure. That evening, Horvik finally asked the question he'd been holding back for weeks. Kid, I don't know where you're from, but I know this isn't blacksmithing anymore. Dan told him the truth, or at least the part of it that mattered. He came from somewhere far away, where machines without horses were an everyday thing. He wasn't a wizard. He wasn't a spirit. He was simply a craftsman who knew more. Horvik finished his beer, set the mug down, and made an offer with no hesitation. 62 years old, no children, and a forge that would die when he did. If you want to build your contraptions, he said, you'll need a forge of your own. It's yours, he said. Not given away, shared. Yours to build in, mine to help in. Dan held out his hand. Horvik's grip felt like it was carved from the same iron. Grandma Ruth came out with a pie, looked at both of them, and simply said, finally. For the first time in this world, Dan felt like more than just a survivor. He was becoming something else now, and the something else had only just begun. He told Horvik the truth, or the part of it that actually mattered. He'd come from somewhere far away, where horseless machines were an everyday sight. Not a wizard, not a spirit, just a craftsman who knew things this world hadn't learned yet. News of the horseless cart spread through Grimshall and barely to Days Flat. Dan never spread the story himself. Small towns simply worked that way on their own. By the end of the week, the tale had grown wild, strange details attached. Some swore the wagon flew. Others swore a demon turned the wheels from inside. Dan heard the rumors and paid them no mind at all. He had bigger problems. He needed a real steam boiler now, not a blacksmith's simple water heating tub. Something pressure-tight, able to hold at least 3 atmospheres without splitting apart. A firebox for coal, a steam outlet feeding straight into a piston assembly. In his old life, he'd restore 3 separate steam engines down to the last bolt. The problem here wasn't knowledge. The problem was copper, and copper here was scarce. He needed 40 pounds of it, and 40 pounds cost more than Horvik earned in months. He sat over his slate blueprints one evening, turning the problem over and over. That was the exact moment Brandon Marquette walked into the smithy uninvited. A sturdy merchant near 45, neat beard, sharp eyes, dressed well, but not showy. He used to own 3 trade caravans. Now horse prices had risen 8-fold. Only one caravan still ran, and it crawled out once every 2 full months. Marquette had come to see the velomobile for himself, and he studied it in silence. He sat on the seat, he pressed the pedals, he rode 3 unsteady steps. Then he asked if something like this could carry cargo instead of a rider. Dan said it was possible, but not on legs. It would take steam power instead. He explained it plainly. Water boils, steam builds pressure, pressure drives a piston forward. Marquette listened without interrupting once, then asked the only question a merchant ever asks. How much? And how soon? Dan told him the truth without softening any of it. 40 pounds of copper, good iron, tools, a skilled foundryman, and 3 full months. Marquette waited. 3 lost caravan trips, or 1 very strange bet on a stranger. He offered the copper, the iron, the tools, and a foundryman in exchange for one thing: the first finished vehicle, and the right to be first to haul his own cargo. They shook on it. Horvik called Marquette a sly fox who always kept his word. The copper arrived a week later, 42 pounds of greenish sheet copper, real copper. Dan held the sheet in his hands and very nearly wept on the spot. A foundryman came with the shipment, a quiet man named Gareth, scorched hands and few words. He studied Dan's slate drawings and asked why the tubes needed such thin walls. Dan explained that thinner walls moved heat faster, which meant faster boiling and sooner steam. Gareth thought it over for a moment, then simply said he could manage it. Work began immediately. Dan slept for hours a night for the weeks that followed. He reconstructed the design from memory: an early single-acting cylinder, simple and forgiving. Steam pushes the piston down. A flywheel's own weight pulls it back up again. Rough, inefficient, but reliable, and reliable was the only luxury this world could afford. Garrett's soldering turned out clean and tight, a real craftsman working real copper. The hardest part was the safety valve. Too much pressure, and the whole boiler would burst. There were no springs strong enough here, so Dan improvised something else entirely. A weighted lever, a lead ball pressing down on the valve until steam overpowered it. Simple, adjustable, and Horvik understood it in an instant. A balance scale, but for steam. The cylinder had to be smooth inside, with no lathe anywhere in this world to help. Dan polished it by hand for hours, sand and stone and rag, day after day. His shoulder ached so badly some nights he couldn't lift his own arm afterward. The crankshaft took another week, forged by hand, crooked and rough, but precise where it mattered. The flywheel came from an old millstone, a heavy stone disc Horvik gave up gladly. Horvik asked why they needed it at all. Dan explained what a flywheel actually stores: rotational energy, held in motion, keeping the whole system from stalling between each stroke. Horvik said something Dan never forgot: you see the world differently than we do. You see that in every motion, something can be saved and spent again later. The full assembly took 3 more days, everything bolted to a single wooden frame. No wheels yet, just a stationary engine, waiting to prove that any of this worked. Word of a strange forge project reached further than Grimshall's own market square. A traveling peddler mentioned it in the next town, half joking, half amazed. Someone in that town repeated it to a caravan guard heading south toward the capital. None of them knew what they were really spreading. None of them understood the stakes. Back in the yard, the frame Dan built was not one machine, but many small ones. Every joint had failed at least once before it finally held its shape properly. The valve stem seized twice during fitting, and twice Dan filed it down by hand. Gareth grew quieter as the weeks went on, not from doubt, but from focus. He cast bronze for guilds his whole life and never once been asked questions like these. Why thinner walls? Why this exact curve? Why bronze here and iron there instead? Each answer Dan gave rewired something in the older man's understanding of his own craft. Horvik kept the forge running for ordinary customers, even while the strange project consumed the yard. Nails still needed forging, horseshoes still needed shaping, the village still needed its blacksmith. Somehow the old man did both, sleeping less, saying less, working through both at once. One night, a support strut cracked under the boiler's weight before it was even fired. Dan stared at the crack for a long moment, then simply started reinforcing it. No panic, no despair, just the next fix, and then the fix after that one. Grandma Ruth noticed the change in him. She said he moved like a man possessed. Not by anything dark, she added, possessed by the work itself and nothing else. By the 4th week, the crankshaft alone had eaten 12 hours straight at the anvil. Dan and Horvik traded the hammer back and forth until neither could feel his own arms. By dawn, it was done. Crooked, rough with burrs, but precise where the tolerances mattered. The flywheel came next, a heavy stone disc salvaged from a broken millstone nearby. Horvik asked again why they needed something so heavy just to keep momentum going. Dan explained it a second time, more patiently, because some ideas need saying twice. Every motion holds something worth saving, he said, and the flywheel simply saves it. Horvik repeated the phrase back to himself for days afterward, turning it over like a coin. The full assembly took 3 more days, every piece bolted onto one wooden frame. Boiler, cylinder, piston, connecting rod, crankshaft, flywheel, all of it waiting in total silence. No wheels yet, just a stationary engine standing in the yard like a held breath. Dan checked every bolt twice, then a third time. His hands would not stop moving. Gareth asked if something was wrong. Dan said everything was about to be tested at once. Word had somehow reached 3 farmers from the next village over, curious about the rumors. They stood at the fence that morning, arms crossed, waiting to see a madman fail. Dan hadn't slept the night before. Not from nerves, from simply not wanting to stop. He walked the whole assembly one final time, checking every seam by lamplight alone. Horvik found him there past midnight and told him to rest before he collapsed. Dan said he would rest after, one way or another, and Horvik let it go. By sunrise, the yard smelled of cold dust, cold iron, and something like fear. 3 farmers at the fence had become 5. Word traveled faster than any of them realized. A boy climbed the fence post for a better view and was pulled down twice. Grandma Ruth set a towel over her shoulder, the way she did before anything important. Gareth stood a little farther back than usual, close enough to watch, far enough to run. Horvik didn't move at all. He simply folded his arms and waited like stone. Dan crouched by the firebox one last time, and for a moment his hands went still. Then he struck the flint, and the first flame caught the coal beneath the boiler. On the morning of the first test, Dan filled the boiler and lit the firebox. Horvik stood close. Gareth waited near the corner. Grandma Ruth stood on the porch, watching. The water heated slowly. The minutes dragged on longer than Dan could ever remember. Then a faint whistle rose from beneath the boiler lid. Pressure was finally building. When the whistle turned steady, Dan opened the valve feeding the cylinder at last. Steam struck the piston. The connecting rod jerked. The crankshaft turned. The flywheel swung. Then it stopped dead. Not enough steam. The pressure was still far too low. He added coal. He waited. He opened the valve again with his jaw set tight. The flywheel turned a quarter revolution, and then it stopped a second time. A leak. Steam was escaping past the piston seal faster than it could build. He tore the cylinder open, added another layer of oiled leather, and sealed it again. He stoked the fire once more. He waited. The whistle rose steady and sure this time. He opened the valve, and the piston struck hard and the connecting rod pulled. The crankshaft turned. The flywheel swung past dead center, and then it kept turning. A second revolution, a third, a fourth. The engine was alive, wheezing, knocking, running. White steam poured from the pipe. Red heat glowed from the open firebox door. A sound tore out of Dan's throat that was half laughter and half raw scream. Horvik stood completely still, watching the flywheel spin on nothing but fire and water. Tears ran down the old blacksmith's face, and he wasn't ashamed of a single one. For the first time in his whole life, he was watching fire become motion. Grandma Ruth crossed herself. Gareth stood frozen with his mouth hanging wide open. The engine ran for 7 straight minutes before the piston seal finally burned through. The flywheel slowed, the steam thinned. The machine came to a gentle, hard-earned stop. Dan sat down hard in the dust, his hands shaking, 7 minutes ringing in his ears. 7 minutes was enough. The principle worked. The materials held. The valve held. Everything held. Everything else from here on was simply refinement, tedious and long, but only refinement. Horvik walked over, put a hand on his shoulder, and said absolutely nothing at all. Grandma Ruth brought tea. The 3 of them sat by the cooling engine in total silence. No words were needed. None of them had ever seen fire turn into motion before. The next 6 weeks were a kind of pleasant hell, where everything broke daily. Dan replaced the piston seal 11 times before he finally found something that held. Leather burned through, oiled linen slipped. Then Grandma Ruth handed him a piece of black stone. Graphite. Natural, soft. The best dry lubricant Dan had ever known in either life. He ground it to powder, packed it into the linen seal, and tried again. The seal held for 40 minutes, then an hour, then 2 hours without failing once. He hugged Grandma Ruth and told her she'd just made a mechanical engineering breakthrough. She said she had no idea what that meant, but she had a whole bag more. Horvik watched the whole exchange and said the two of them made a strange pair of engineers. Grandma Ruth just laughed and went back inside to check on something burning in the oven. While the seal held, Dan built the undercarriage in every spare hour he had. An oak frame with an iron skeleton for wheels, rear ones driven by the engine. He ordered wheels from Tobias the wheelwright, wide and iron-rimmed, an old friend of Horvik. Tobias had never built wheels that wide before, but he agreed for the silver coins. The transmission stayed simple, a belt to an intermediate shaft, a chain to the rear axle. One speed, no gearbox. More steam meant faster. Less steam meant slower. No steam meant stopped. The brake was a wooden block pressed to the rim by hand, rough but enough. The steering copied an old design Dan remembered from a museum piece back home. A central kingpin, a linkage running from lever to axle, an enormous turning radius. The biggest problem wasn't the engine at all. The biggest problem was water. The engine drank a barrel an hour, and the journey to the capital took for days. Dan built a copper-lined tank for the roof, enough for 2 hours before refilling. A machine doesn't get tired, he told Horvik. It doesn't sleep. It just needs coal and water. By the 6th week, the tractor stood assembled, and it was an ugly, beautiful monster. A smokestack up front, a water tank at the back, a boiler wrapped in brick. Straps, chains, and struts held the whole frame together, creaking faintly in the wind. Marquette arrived the morning of their first real trip, dread and hope fighting on his face. Dan filled the tank, lit the firebox, and waited 20 minutes for the pressure to build. The whistle held steady. He opened the valve. The piston struck. The flywheel began to turn. The tractor crawled forward across the yard, slow, creaking, but moving on its own power. It pulled through the gate onto the street, and the whole town stopped to watch. Some ran, a dog barked, a child cried. An old man crossed himself in the road. No human could carry 300 pounds that far. No horse in this town could either. There were no horses left in this town, and that fact was the whole point. The road out was rough, ruts and stones, and one boiler support cracked within the hour. Dan wedged a rock under the base and kept moving without losing much time at all. By evening they had traveled 12 miles. On foot, that same distance took 6 full hours. That night by the campfire, Marquette did the math out loud, slow and deliberate. If this thing could haul 1,000 pounds in for days instead of 10, he said, he'd order 5 more, and he'd pay for every single one of them himself. Dan said one was manageable. 5 men, a workshop, people, training, a steady supply chain. It meant a system, he said. Marquette nodded and said he understood systems better than most men. They shook hands a second time under the stars to very different kinds of builder. The return trip broke down twice, a snapped belt, a jammed valve, a scalded hand. Gareth watched Dan work through the pain without flinching and said something quiet and strange. Either you're not afraid of dying, or you've already been dying, he said. Both were true. They rolled back into Grimshaw the next evening, tired, filthy, and completely unstoppable now. 15 days later, someone came for the truck in the dead of night with a torch. Dan heard the noise and ran out to find 3 men circling his months of work. One held the torch. One poured oil from a jug across the frame's wooden joints. He grabbed the nearest thing, a red-hot iron poker still lying by the forge. He struck the knife from one man's hand before the blade ever touched him. The torch was thrown and fell short, and the oil never caught a single spark. Horvik ran out with an axe. Gareth came around the corner swinging a hammer. The 3 men vanished into the dark, leaving a knife with a symbol on the handle. Crossed horseshoes, the mark of the Equestrian Guild, and its master, a man named Tarville. Marquette said it plainly the next morning. Tarville's fortune rested on horses, and Dan built a world without them. Dan said he wasn't building a world without horses. He was building a world with a choice. Marquette said that to Tarville. There was no difference between the two at all. From that morning on, the truck was never left alone, not for a single minute. 15 days remained before word reached the capital that would change absolutely everything. Marquette hired 2 former soldiers to stand watch at the smithy gate day and night. Dan barely noticed them anymore. He was too deep in repairing what the fire had threatened. The new tractor grew heavier with every improvement, iron strips reinforcing every corner joint. A cargo platform now stretched across the back, wide enough for 800 pounds of freight. Horvik added a canopy over the driver's seat, wood and copper, without being asked to. Dan asked why. Horvik said a man driving history shouldn't be soaked through by the rain. On the 10th day, Dan added something that had nothing to do with speed at all. A real seat, leather-backed instead of a plank nailed crooked across the frame. Horvik asked why waste time on comfort when the machine only needed to run. Dan said the first thing lords and merchants would notice wasn't the piston. It was the driver. Sit like a peasant on a cart, and people see a cart, nothing more than that. Sit like a captain on a ship, and people start to see a ship instead. Horvik studied him for a long moment, then said he wasn't just building a machine anymore. He was building how people would see it, and that mattered just as much as steel. On the 12th day, Dan tested the new machine on the open road outside town. 5 miles out, 5 miles back, with the new wheels holding steady over every rut. On the 13th day, Marquette loaded the platform with grain, salt, and crates of tools. 700 pounds total, and the tractor took the weight without so much as sagging once. A peddler on the road stood frozen, mouth open, then ran after the wagon shouting questions. Dan didn't stop. There wasn't time left to stop for every stunned face on the road. Rumors of the burning attempt had reached farther than Grimshall's own market square by now. A caravan guard mentioned it at a roadside inn days south of town. Someone repeated it to a merchant's clerk, who repeated it inside the capital's own walls. None of them understood yet how far that single burned torch would eventually travel. Inside the capital, in a chamber none of them had ever seen, someone was already listening. A woman sat alone with a stack of failing reports. No horses, no caravans, no hope. She had heard 3 different versions of a story about a cart that moved without horses. 2 versions called it a trick. 1 version called it something else entirely. She believed the 3rd. She didn't send a minister. She didn't send a messenger. She saddled the plain gray mare herself. No entourage. No crown in sight, just a woman in road clothes and 1 old scar-faced guard. For days later, she reached Grimshall's gate and asked a stranger where the ironwork stood. The stranger pointed her toward smoke rising from the southern edge of a town without horses. Then, one afternoon, a woman rode into the blacksmith's yard on a plain gray mare. Red hair tucked under a simple scarf, freckles, and eyes that looked far too tired. She dismounted without waiting for help, and her boots hit the mud like she'd walked it before. Horvik stepped forward first, wary of any stranger who arrived without warning after a burning attempt. The woman said only that she'd heard stories about a cart that moved without any horses. She asked to see the truck, and something in her voice made arguing feel pointless. Dan studied her for a moment. Tired eyes, bitten nails, a stillness that wasn't calm, just controlled. He'd seen that look before, in small business owners who load their own trucks before sunrise. People who don't sleep, don't quit, and carry the whole weight of something alone. He said the tractor was still cooling from the last run, but he'd show her anyway. Dan lit the firebox again. She stood close, watching the boiler, never once flinching. When the piston struck and the flywheel turned, she watched every motion like a student. She asked how it worked, not what it was, and Dan explained it piece by piece. Then she asked something no one else had thought to ask him at all. Why steam, and not wind or water? Dan said wind was unreliable, and rivers were fixed in place. Steam could be made anywhere fire and water existed. That means the machine goes wherever it wants. She repeated the words quietly to herself, free. Goes wherever it wants. Something shifted in her face. She asked for a ride. Dan warned her the boiler mount was still cracked from the road. She said she understood the risk perfectly well, and she climbed aboard without hesitation. Dan looked at Horvik. The old man only shrugged, as if to say the choice wasn't his. He sat her down on the bench, told her to hold the frame, and open the valve. They drove through the gate, down the street, past every staring face in Grimshall. People stopped mid-step to watch a stranger ride a machine no one could yet explain. She sat up straight the entire time, spine unbent as the wheels jolted over every stone. She didn't grab the sides once. She didn't flinch at the whistle or the smoke. Near the end of the street, almost invisible, the corner of her mouth lifted slightly. They turned back at the crossroads, the tractor groaning through the tight arc of the turn. Dan brought it to a stop in front of the gate where they'd started. She stepped down, pulled her plain coat tighter, and stood there for a long moment. When they stopped, she turned to him and said she wanted him to come to the capital. Dan asked why. She said her kingdom was dying, and she needed what she'd just seen. Not for one forge, she said. For the whole country. Before there was nothing left to save. Villages were starving. Roads had grown more dangerous than the forest around them. She needed someone who could do what he'd just shown her, but for an entire nation. Dan was quiet. Horvik was quiet. Even Marquette, listening from around the corner, said nothing. Dan finally asked the only question that mattered. My lady, who are you, really? She hesitated just for a breath, the kind of pause that carries the weight of years. Behind her, the old scar guard shifted his stance, watching Dan's hands more than his face. The yard had gone still. Even the fire in the forge seemed to hold its breath. Grandma Ruth stood frozen in the doorway with the towel forgotten in one hand. Marquette leaned slightly out from behind the corner. no longer bothering to hide that he was listening. Whatever answer was coming, everyone in that yard understood it would not be a small one. She reached up slowly, fingers finding the knot of the plain scarf beneath her chin. Dan asked who she really was. She removed the scarf, and a thin gold band caught the light. "My name is Asara," she said. "I am the queen of this dying kingdom." Horvik dropped to one knee immediately. She stopped him with a single raised hand. She said she hadn't come as a queen. She'd come as a woman looking for a way out. Grandma Ruth stood frozen with her towel still in hand, staring at history arriving unannounced. Marquette stepped fully into view now, no reason left to keep hiding around the corner at all. Dan said he was a mechanic, not a mudge, not a lord, not a miracle worker. She said she wasn't asking for a miracle. She was asking for a plan, nothing more. So he gave her one. A workshop in the capital, people to train, a steady supply chain. At least half a year before results, a full year before real change took hold. She said she'd provide the workshop, find the people, and somehow find the time too. Then she asked why. Why help a dying kingdom instead of selling machines and living easy? Dan told her the truth. In his old life, every car he fixed changed nothing at all. Here, one road meant a sick child reached a doctor instead of dying on the way. That's why, he said. Asara looked at him, and something long buried lifted its head. Hope. She left the next morning with one guard and a warning about a fair in 1 month. Bring the machine, she said. Show that it works, and I can win the council over. If not, then no. She rode off, and Marquette said something Dan hadn't considered yet. The queen came herself. Not a minister, not a messenger. That meant she trusted almost no one. And if Dan failed in front of the council, he wouldn't just fail himself. He'd fail her. 30 days. Dan rebuilt the whole tractor from the frame up, reinforced, faster, sharper looking. Horvik worked beside him without a word, understanding exactly what the stakes have become. 15 days in, 3 men came at night with oil and a torch, same as before. Dan drove them off with a red-hot poker before the flames ever touched the frame. Horvik said only one thing afterward. It's begun. And the work continued anyway. On the 14th day, they left for the capital city of Vaki, for days of hard road. The chain slipped once, a spoke snapped once, a steam pipe clogged once with mineral scale. Every breakdown became a lesson Dan carried forward into the next design without complaint. By the 4th evening, Vaki rose on its hill, stone walls, dark roofs, 100 chimneys. The tractor rolled through the south gate on the strength of a royal charter alone. It crawled down the main street, whistle screaming, smoke pouring, cobblestones rattling under iron wheels. A crowd gathered within minutes. Shopkeepers dropped their wares. Children ran alongside, screaming with delight. Asara watched from a balcony in a royal gown, a thin crown catching the afternoon light. Beside her stood a tall gray-haired man radiating quiet contempt. Gaston Tarville, the Equestrian Guild's master. Their eyes met across the square, and Dan felt something colder than any threat. Confidence. Tarville was certain the machine would fail, or that he would make certain that it did. At noon, Asara addressed the square. She spoke of starving villages and roads gone to ruin. She spoke of a kingdom that had to find a new path or simply cease to exist. Then she nodded to Dan, and Dan didn't give a speech. He simply lit the boiler. The crowd gasped as one when the flywheel turned and the tractor rolled forward on its own. He circled the square once empty, then loaded 700 pounds and circled it again, loaded. Fear turned into disbelief. Disbelief turned into understanding. This wasn't magic. It was iron and fire. He stopped before the balcony. Isara's hands were clenched into fists, her eyes shining with something fierce. Tarville sat motionless, but his knuckles had gone white against the armrest of his chair. The council voted that evening, 7 in favor, 3 against. 2 abstained from the decision entirely. Dan received a workshop in the capital, a year of funding, and a royal charter of protection. Tarville and 2 allies had voted against him, and Asara said he would figure out why. The workshop was an old carriage house on the eastern edge of the city, roof leaking, wall sound. Dan stood in the empty space and saw not ruins, but the shape of everything to come. Horvik arrived from Grimshall a week later, unwilling to fully abandon his own forge behind him. The first apprentices came within days, to discharge royal guards. 2 of Marquette's own workers' sons, and one skinny 17-year-old named Thomas Gray, who had watched the machine in the square for 3 days straight. Dan taught them from nothing. Not one of them knew what a piston even was at first. A month later, 5 students could take a steam cylinder apart and rebuild it correctly. Thomas turned out to have golden hands and the same hunger Dan remembered from his own youth. Then Margaret Marquette arrived, Brandon's daughter, running his business after he broke his leg on a donkey. She spread a stack of unpaid bills across Dan's blueprints and told him the numbers were bad. Expenses were 4 times higher than revenue. She'd already found 3 miles of wasted road. Dan argued. She argued back harder. From that day, the workshop split cleanly into halves. Dan built the machines. Maggie built the business, and neither one of them ever fully agreed. Then came Sister Lillian, a nun with a bag of notebooks copied since she was 12 years old. Inside was an old drawing of a steam cylinder, precise, dimensioned, made by someone who understood everything. It came from monastery archives 300 years old, drawings the church had once tried to destroy. Dan explained the whole design to her, and for hours, she wrote every word down without pause. Deep in a later notebook, a different hand appeared. Sharper lines, notes in the Latin alphabet, a double-acting steam engine, a design Dan knew from his own world. Drawn here 3 centuries early. He sat staring at it until the candle burned down, because someone before him had already tried this. Lillian returned from the archives days later with an answer that chilled the whole room. 300 years ago, an engineering guild called the Brotherhood of the Iron Road built exactly this. Then, overnight, their workshops burned, their blueprints were seized. Most of their masters were executed outright. The official record blamed the gods. A hidden monk's note blamed something else entirely. A secret council. The Order of the Silent Wheel. The note called them, sworn to keep the world from moving too fast. Dan asked if the order still existed. Lillian said there was no way to know for certain. No records could mean it had vanished, or simply gotten better at staying hidden all along. Not long after, General Arthur Kane arrived with news that changed the shape of everything again. The Holger Empire was massing troops at the border. 12,000 cavalry against an army with no horses left. Kane said what he needed wasn't iron horses. He needed logistics faster than any enemy could organize. 5 tractors by winter, he said, built to move 2,000 pounds through mud and snow. Dan did the math in his head. 1 machine took 2 months. 5 would take 10. Isara said she'd provide everything he needed to close that gap: workshop, people, materials, time itself. Dan asked if she was staking everything she had on one mechanic from a backwater town. Yes, she said, because I have nothing else left to stake at all. That same week, a thin woman with a knife on her belt walked into the workshop at night. Ashley were. Her father had tried to build steam engines 15 years earlier, alone, unsupported. The Horse Guild had burned his workshop with him still inside it, and she'd become a bandit. She handed Dan her father's notebook, rough blueprints, full of mistakes. But blueprints all the same. I want to finish what he started, she said, or kill those who stopped him. Maybe both. Dan asked if she knew metal. She said her father taught her since she was 6 years old. He said, then come in. And she stepped inside like someone finally arriving home. Ash turned out to have hands like a musician, feeling a bolt's tightness the way others hear music. She argued with everyone within a month: Maggie, Lillian, Thomas, and especially Dan himself. One evening he found her alone with her father's notebook, open to an almost finished page. He was a good man, she said quietly. Dan said she was a good person too, whether she believed it or not. Meanwhile, Heron arrived, a hunted alchemist with a scarred brow and lubricants no one else could make. Dan let her in without asking questions, and within days the engines ran smoother than ever. Winter approached fast, and 5 military tractors rose from the workshop floor, one grinding week at a time. Then 3 drivers failed to show up for work, and Thomas found out why. Masked men had threatened their families in the night. The same tactic that killed Ash's father years earlier. Dan went straight to the palace. Isara listened, and by evening every family stood under royal guard. She came to the workshop herself and told every worker there that her protection covered them all. Tarville struck back through the council instead, demanding an investigation into dangerous, godless machinery. He brought a farmer, a priest, and a doctor, each with a complaint built from nothing solid. Dan answered with one fact only: 14,000 pounds delivered to mountain villages. 7 children saved by doctors. I'm ready to stop everything right now, he said, if a cow's comfort outweighs a child's life. The council voted 10-2 to continue. Tarville walked out without looking back at anyone. Maggie said a cornered animal bites harder, and she was right more than anyone wanted to admit. By the end of winter, 5 tractors stood finished, tested, and ready for the northern border. General Kane accepted them personally, shook every hand in the workshop, and called it a debt he owed. The trucks rolled out toward the border, and Dan stood at the gate watching them disappear around the bend. Spring came, and with it, Route 1, a paved road built from the rubble of old ruins. 40 former slum workers crushed stone under Horvick's patient supervision, layer by careful layer. A steamroller compacted the gravel flat, a heavy cast-iron cylinder towed behind a tractor. 10 miles finished by the second month. Then the first regular passenger route, a steam omnibus. 12 seats, 1 copper coin a fare, running once a day between the capital and Crossmoor. On the first trip, a boy boarded clutching a live piglet to his chest like treasure. By the third day, people stood in line before dawn just to ride it into town. Alongside the roads, Lillian and Dan built something else. A steam-powered printing press for the blueprints, an engraved copper plate, a lever driven by steam, and 1,000 identical copies within reach. The first print came out clean, every line, every number, every mark copied exactly. Now they won't be able to destroy it, Lillian said, her hands trembling around the paper. We'll print 1,000 copies and send them to every monastery, every forge, every corner of the kingdom. 50 sets went out that week, to monasteries, to caravans, to the northern military post, to the students. These aren't my blueprints anymore, Dan told his apprentices. They're yours. Study them, copy them, pass them on. Thomas asked why he was saying it that way, like something might happen to him soon. Dan didn't answer. He only looked at Ash, and she looked back, and they both already knew. Then, one morning, Isara sent for him with a single word, urgent. General Kane's face had gone the color of ash when Dan reached the palace room. The Holger Empire had mobilized early, 20,000 soldiers, 12,000 cavalry. 3 weeks from the capital's gates, a head-on battle was impossible. 3,000 soldiers could never stand against 20,000 in open field. Isara sat perfectly still, her nails bitten to the quick, her hands folded like a woman praying. Dan looked at the map for a long moment, then said the only thing that made any sense. We won't stop them, he said. We'll outpace them completely before they ever reach the wall. Ken raised an eyebrow. Dan explained it the only way he knew how. Like a machine. 20,000 mouths need feeding every single day. That supply line was the whole army's only weakness. Our trucks move 30 miles a day. Their marching column moves 15 at best, on a good road. We can't win a battle, he said, but we can be everywhere before they ever arrive. Evacuate every village in their path, empty the wells, strip the land of anything they can eat, move mobile fortifications by truck, set them up, tear them down, and vanish before they ever engage. Feed our own soldiers hot meals from steam kitchens while the enemy starves in the open field. This isn't tactics, he said. It's arithmetic. And arithmetic doesn't care how many horses you own. Kane was silent for a long time. Then he said, this is madness. Then he said, this might work. Isara stood, walked to the map, looked at it, then looked at Dan and said one word, go. The next 3 weeks became a different kind of hell, one measured in hours of sleep, not days. All 10 tractors mobilized at once, hauling families south, hauling fortifications north, running through day and night. Maggie rode a donkey from village to village, persuading, yelling, and crying with those who wouldn't leave. Dan drove one truck himself for 12 straight hours, an old woman's goat gripped by the horns beside him. Ash drove the northern line, 3 metric tons of fortification lumber roaring uphill through the mud. Horvik never left the workshop, repairing broken chains and cracked frames as fast as they came in. On the 21st day, right on schedule, the Imperial Army crossed into a kingdom stripped bare and silent. Not a single village stood in their path. Not a single well still held water to drink. The wells had been filled in. The bridges had been dismantled. The roads had been dug up entirely. After 3 days, fodder ran short. After 5, the cavalry horses began to visibly weaken. Mobile fortifications appeared on the horizon, held their ground, and vanished before any charge could land. The Imperial cavalry rode 5 miles to strike them, and found only empty ground waiting instead. 5 miles further on, the same fortification stood again, as if it had never moved at all. Imperial scouts reported smoking machines on the road. Their generals dismissed it as cowards' rumor. By the 12th day of the invasion, the Imperial army had stopped moving entirely, and started starving. Horses collapsed in their traces. Soldiers went hungry. The artillery sank into mud with no oxen left to pull it. General Holt sent a rider forward under a flag of truce, asking for terms he didn't want to name. Isara received the messenger on horseback herself on purpose, so the story would travel back with him. Somewhere behind the Imperial lines, an army that could not eat had already lost a war it never fought. And somewhere behind Dan's own lines, a man Isara had trusted her whole life had already vanished into the night. He did not know it yet, but the silence from Tarville's estate was about to answer every question he'd been afraid to ask. The night after the truce was signed, the camp fell quiet along the northern road at last. 10 tractors stood cooling in a row, machines that had ended a war without firing a single shot. Dan sat by the fire fixing a stuck steam valve, hands moving on their own from pure exhaustion. Isara sat close by, hands wrapped around a mug of tea, staring hard into the flames. You know Tarville fled, she said quietly. Dan looked up. He hadn't heard that yet. For advisors vanished with him, along with every document from his personal archive. Gone overnight. Can sent men to the estate. The stables stood empty. The safes had been broken open from inside. But behind a false wall in his study, the guards found a bundle they hadn't expected at all. Isara pulled it from beneath her cloak and handed it across the fire without a word. Dan unwrapped it by firelight. Letters. Old ones, the earliest dated 20 years back at least. Signed only with a symbol, a circle split by 8 spokes like a wheel cut into wax. The same mark Dan had once glanced at on a shed wall and forgotten entirely. Letter after letter discussed an engineer named Reedwer, and the danger he posed by simply existing. Reedwer is too close. One letter read. Another read. Reedwer has been eliminated. The last letter was dated 6 months earlier, and it named Dan Hopper by name. The reply beneath it was 4 words long, the same 4 words used 300 years before. Dan set the papers down slowly. Isara was watching him, her hands steady around the mug now. The Order of the Silent Wheel, she said. It's real. And Tarville was one of them. My regent, she said. The man who rocked me on his lap when I was a child. Dan asked if they would come again. Isara said the Order was never just one man. It was a network, buried in every court, every guild, every kingdom, for 300 years running. Dan stared into the fire for a long moment before he finally answered her question. They stopped the Brotherhood because the knowledge lived only in people's heads, and heads can be silenced. They stopped Reedwer because he worked alone, and alone men can always be found and ended. But this time, he said, the knowledge isn't in one head anymore. It's on paper in 100 hands. To stop this now, he said, you'd have to burn the entire kingdom to the ground. And that isn't an order anymore, he said quietly. That's a war, and we just won one of those. He did not know it yet, but somewhere in the dark, a man in a gray coat was already writing his own report. The next morning, the army turned back toward the capital. Trucks loaded with the wounded and the tired. Isara refused the carriage and rode in the lead truck instead, beside the man who had saved her kingdom. Maggie rode behind them, already calculating repairs. Lillian printed war reports on the moving press as they traveled. Ash brought up the rear in the most battered truck of all, and refused to let anyone else drive it. As they neared the capital, a crowd gathered that no one in Weldmar had seen in 3 long years. Thousands of people lined the road, not for a battle won, but for a war that never had to happen. Dan climbed down from the lead truck, and his legs nearly buckled from 3 straight weeks without real rest. Horvik caught him before he hit the ground, and neither of them said a single word about it. Grandma Ruth pushed a bowl of stew into his hands and told him, simply, tea. Dan ate standing in the workshop yard, surrounded by the strange family this world had somehow given him. And for the first time in 2 years of this second life, he didn't think about what came next. He didn't know it yet, but somewhere behind him, the man in the gray coat had already moved on to a new page. General Holt accepted the truce terms because an army that cannot eat cannot keep fighting anyone. Full withdrawal, recognition of Weldmar's borders, a trade agreement written entirely on Weldmar's own terms. Not one battle had been fought, and not one soldier had died charging into open ground. An empire of 20,000 had been turned back by roads dug up and wells filled in. By the time the council convened again, word of the bloodless victory had already reached every corner of the capital. No one dared question the machines this time. No one brought a farmer or a frightened priest. Kane stood before the council himself and said plainly that logistics had won. What soldiers could not? Isara didn't need to argue for Dan's charter again. The charter argued for itself now. Search parties combed the border regions for Tarville for weeks, and found nothing but cold trails. 2 of his allied lords resigned quietly from the council rather than face the questions being asked. Isara didn't purge the court the way some advisors wanted. She rebuilt it, one trusted name at a time. She placed Kane in charge of border defense, and gave Maggie's father a permanent seat on trade matters. Lillian's monastery was granted royal protection for its archives, and for anyone who wished to study them openly. The Order of the Silent Wheel did not surface again that year, but no one believed it was finished. Dan kept working anyway, because waiting for a shadow to reappear was no way to build anything at all. Every road he paved, every blueprint he printed, was one more brick the Order could no longer easily burn. Winter passed, spring came. The wounds of the invasion healed slower in the villages than on any map, but the villages healed. Grain moved, salt moved. Doctors reached children who would once have simply been lost. That was the real ledger, Dan thought. Not silver, not a council vote. Just who lived and who didn't. A year passed, and Dan stood on a hill outside the capital looking down at what they'd built. Route 1 stretched south, 20 miles of smooth stone where mud and ruts once ruled the road. Route 2 ran east. Route 3 climbed north toward the pass that once nearly killed him. 3 roads, 3 directions. 3 arteries carrying the blood of a kingdom that finally moved again. The morning omnibus rolled along Route 1, white steam trailing above the rooftops below. 15 passengers a day now. An old woman visiting her daughter. A farmer selling milk by lunchtime. A boy from beyond the pass rode in each morning just to attend the new capital school. 40 students studied there now, apprentices learning assembly, casting, drafting, chemistry, and repair, all at once. Thomas taught assembly. Ash taught repairs. Gareth taught casting. Lillian taught drafting and calculation. Dan gave 1 lecture a week, and it was never about engines. It was always about systems. A road without a station is a dead end, he told them. A station without a mechanic is a trap. Everything is connected, he said, and a true engineer learns to see the connections, not just the parts. Grimshall had grown too. Orders backed up 3 months deep at Horvick's old forge. Run now by a journeyman. Bridgewater had a working mill of its own, copied stone for stone from Dan's very first repair. Stonebridge, the mountain village that once wept over a single barrel of salt, had a shop now. Children there no longer salted their food with ash, and no one there had forgotten why. The villages along the routes had come back to life in ways no council decree could have ordered. Marquette, walking again on a crooked leg, had founded the first transport company without a single horse. Maggie ran it in practice long before it became official on paper. 12 tractors strong now. The first steamboat launched that fall, a flat-bottomed barge with a turning paddle wheel. It carried 5 metric tons upriver against the current, 9 days instead of to full months by cart. Maggie stood on the deck beside him and said they'd just ended horse-drawn transport on the whole river. Dan didn't answer. He was thinking about Tarville, somewhere out there, still part of something far larger. The river banks drifted by slowly, sunlight glinting off water that had never once carried an engine before. Maggie's dark hair had come loose from its braid, and the wind pulled at it without asking permission. Dan looked at the river, then at her, and she caught the look and raised an eyebrow. What? Nothing, he said. You're lying, she said. I'm lying, he agreed, and she almost smiled at that. A week after the barge launched, he finally built the one thing he'd promised himself long before. A stove for Grandma Ruth, adjustable heat, an oven, a water heater, a chimney that carried the smoke safely outside. She placed both hands on the warm copper plate and stood there without speaking for a long moment. Then she turned to him and called him son, a word she had never once used before. Dan hugged her. She smelled the flour and smoke and every meal she'd ever fed him. Grandma Ruth had raised no children of her own, and had spent a lifetime believing she never would. Horvick stood in the doorway that evening, wiping his eyes with the back of one rough hand. It's a good stove, he grumbled, though the pipe's a little crooked. Dan only laughed at that. That night, in the basement of the Royal Archive, he found what he'd been searching for without knowing it. A leather-bound bundle, cracked with age, tucked behind a wall of forgotten crates. Inside was a drawing, detailed, precise, a double-acting engine with a speed regulator. 300 years old. In the corner, in small handwriting, in his own handwriting, was a single short note. If you're reading this, it means you've ended up here too. The note read plainly. So the bridge goes both ways, it said. So the world calls again. Don't give up. They'll try to stop you the way they stopped me, it read, but you'll be smarter this time. Don't keep this knowledge to yourself. The note said, share it, everyone. They can't kill everyone. Signed, D. Hopper. Dan stared at his own signature written 300 years before he was born here. He wasn't an outsider who had fallen into this world by accident at all. He was the answer this world had already given itself. Once, and lost, and tried again. The first time, the order had found him alone, unrecorded, easy to erase from every history. This time, there were 40 students, a printing press, and 1,000 copies scattered past any single fire's reach. This time, there was Thomas, and Ash, and Lillian, and Maggie, and Heron, and a stubborn old blacksmith too. This time, there was a queen who had staked her entire crown on one mechanic and never once looked back. The blueprints had survived anyway, in a monastery. In a notebook a girl had copied since she was 12. He had returned across the same bridge of water and darkness 300 years later, and finished the work. He rolled the drawing carefully, tucked it inside his shirt, and climbed the stairs into the night. 2 moons hung over the Capitol. A steam whistle called somewhere far off on its evening run. He walked back toward the workshop, where lights still burned and laughter still spilled through the open door. Maggie was arguing with Ash about a schedule. Lillian was teaching Heron the pressure regulator. Patient and slow. Grandma Ruth clattered at her new stove. Horvik hammered somewhere in the back, steady as ever. Thomas sang badly off key and Gareth told him, for the 100th time, to please stop. The door opened, and Asara stepped out without her crown, carrying 2 mugs of hot cider. She sat beside him on the steps and handed one over without a single word between them. "Daniel," she said finally, "I don't know who you really are, or where you're truly from, but if you ever decide to go back to wherever that is, I will understand completely. Just know this," she said. "All of us, because of you, are alive for the first time." Dan looked at his own hands, black with oil, scarred, calloused, a craftsman's hands in either life. He looked at her tired eyes, her bitten nails, her freckles catching the lamplight. "I'm not going anywhere," he said, and he meant every single word of it completely. She studied him for a long moment, then rested her head gently against his shoulder, and left it there. Behind them, the workshop glowed with light and noise and the smell of oil and Grandma Ruth's pie. Ahead of them lay the city, and beyond the city, roads, and beyond the roads, a whole world finally moving. Far off at the edge of the square, a man in a gray coat watched the lit windows for a moment. He wrote something small in a notebook, closed it, and walked away into the dark without a sound. Dan wasn't thinking about him. Not tonight. Tonight, the cider was hot, and Izra's shoulder was warm. 300 years ago, a man tried to give this world an engine, and the world took his life instead. This time, the world had learned to keep the knowledge even when it couldn't keep the man. 1,000 printed blueprints now sat in 100 workshops, in the hands of students who taught more students. No single fire could reach all of them now. No single order could silence all of them now. That was the quiet victory beneath the louder one, the one no army or council vote could measure. Not a machine, not a war won without a single battle, a stubborn, ordinary, human decision to share. Somewhere out there, Tarville still carried the mark of a circle split by 8 spokes, hidden and waiting. Somewhere out there, others like him still believed the world moved better when it didn't move at all. Dan didn't know when they'd come back, only that they would, sooner or later. The way shadows always do. And when they did, they'd find a kingdom that no longer had just one mechanic to silence. They'd find 40 students, 100 printed blueprints, and a queen who no longer needed convincing of anything. They'd find a world that had already learned the one lesson the Order feared most of all. That knowledge shared cannot be burned the same way a single workshop can be burned to the ground. In the morning, Dan would rise, take his tools, and walk back into the forge like always. He would build, and repair, and teach, because that was the only thing he had ever truly known how to do. He had done it in one life, then died, then done it again in another, and he was not finished yet. 2 moons rose together over a kingdom that had finally fully learned how to move forward on its own. And somewhere in that light, a farmhand who had once been mistaken for a corpse kept building anyway. Not for glory, not for a crown he never wanted, just for the people who were still here to see it. He thought of the bearded man with the pitchfork who had once looked at him like a corpse. He thought of the bread that had been real, even when nothing else around him had made any sense. A mill had turned, a bicycle had rolled, and an engine had finally caught fire, one after another. Horvik's handshake still felt like iron in his memory, and Grandma Ruth's stove was warm under the palms. Lillian had spent 12 years copying drawings she never understood, until someone finally explained them to her. Ash had carried her father's unfinished notebook into a stranger's workshop, and found a home inside it. Izra's shoulder had rested against his own, and a kingdom had learned, slowly, how to breathe again. None of it had been magic. None of it had ever needed to be. It had only ever needed hands willing to work, and people willing to share what those hands built. That, in the end, was the whole of it. A man with a wrench, and a world worth building.